The Dark Below by Lux Noctis. The goldfish floated on the surface, bobbing gently on its side within the tiny tank that was its entire world. Aurora sighed from behind the glass, her warm breath creating a fog upon it that obscured her view. She cupped delicate hands and scooped up the fish from the water, crossing her modest apartment to the bathroom. Dropping it into the toilet, she pulled the chain, and it spiraled its way into a most undignified end. Wiping her palms on her shirt, Aurora ambled back into the living space. Taking a battered old guitar in hand, she slumped onto the bed and began to pluck at the strings with nails grown for the purpose. As she tuned her instrument, a rhythmic, gentle patter caught her ear. She glanced up at the ceiling and spotted a warped, discolored spot. It fell into an inverted peak, and from that peak, droplets fell, splashing onto the wooden flooring. Aurora released another exasperated huff, knowing the landlord would care little about her increasingly shabby home. Then she lay down on her back, and facing the heavens, she began to play. As dusk made its presence known, sending golden light into the bathroom through a frosted window, Aurora bathed. Smooth jazz played quietly on a worn-out radio, the music unstructured and ever-flowing. She submerged herself, and rinsed suds from long hair that was a chocolate brown. Beneath the water, the world above became muted. Somehow, though, a muffled scuttling seemed to find her ears, as if something were moving close by. The woman in the tub raised herself from the depths, listening carefully to see if the phenomenon persisted, but all was peaceful. The humid air in the bathroom filled her lungs, yet it was unsatisfying, as the stifling heat caused her to be breathless in spite of it. Feeling suffocated, she quickly washed her blushing face and climbed out of the bath, wrapping a heavy towel around her exposed body. Before she could dry herself off, a startling clatter came from outside of the room. A sense of being uncomfortably defenseless began to manifest itself as Aurora left the bathroom in her disrobed state. Her every movement caused her damp skin to feel a chill that otherwise would have not been, and her concern grew as she inched her way towards the origin of the sound. When she rounded the corner, the cause of commotion caught her attention. A grate, part of the apartment's ventilation system, had come free from the wall and fallen to the ground. Liquid leaked from the open vent and pooled around the dented metal cover as it lay there uselessly. Aurora cursed under her breath and marched indignantly towards her phone. Flipping through the phone book, she found the number for the building's maintenance man. But when she called, a robotic voice told her that the number was no longer in use. Irritated, she slammed the phone back into its cradle, her mood becoming suitably sour. Trapped in a realm of abstract unreality, a slender figure wandered, lost and isolated. Oppressive force seemed to close in from all sides, making her movement slow and unrelentingly tiring. Shapes most unclear twisted and twirled, undulating unnaturally before dispersing and becoming one with the dense sky. The woman reached out, trying to take in hand that which moved so gracefully, where she could scarcely move at all. Alas, the ethereal forms were always just out of reach. After a time, all hope left the girl who roamed, for she would always be alone, with that realization her only companion. She lay down upon the sand and stared up into the void. There, in peaceful silence, she closed her eyes and waited to die. In the middle of the night, the sleeping lady awoke to the sensation of a colossal weight upon her chest. Panic came immediately, and as Aurora's eyes adjusted to the lack of light, she caught the sight of what had bound her. Long, slimy appendages lay across her body and held her tightly. She gasped, hoping to draw in enough breath to scream. However, before she could make a sound, more of the slick, amorphous arms found their way across her throat. Aurora could not speak or move, and that which squeezed the life out of her seemed to be stronger as her desperation grew. The disgusting limbs contracted ever tighter, and trapped in the bed, she started to fade. Spots began to form in her vision, and a heart with no air to pump beat ever faster in a futile attempt to keep her conscious. In an instant, it was all over. The strange entity was gone, and she was free to inhale again. Panting frantically and on the verge of a panic attack, Aurora clambered out of bed. Her anxious eyes scoured the room. There was nothing out of the ordinary, and there seemed to be no reasonable place that the mysterious being could have come from, if it were truly there at all. Nervously, she dropped to the ground and peeked beneath where she slept, but there was naught to be found below. An unexpected thump came from the ceiling overhead, and Aurora flinched reflexively. The damp spot above began to drip again, birthing an irritating rhythm. The floorboards upon which it landed had already begun to distort, and so, trying to regain her grip on normality, the shaken girl retrieved a bucket from her storage closet and placed it beneath the leak. The sound of every droplet was amplified by it, landing with a shrill clang. Outside of the busy cafe, the Parisian streets were crowded with both locals and tourists alike. Inside the premises was almost as chaotic in its own right. Weary from a lack of slumber and rushed off her feet by the hectic pace of her workload, Aurora dashed from table to table taking orders and clearing away the messes of countless patrons. Her restless hours had been spent researching the possible cause of her late-night terror, but the possibility of sleep paralysis or sudden onset psychosis did little to improve her feelings about the bizarre event. At a table near the window that overlooked the crowded sidewalk, a red-faced boy cried loudly, and the sound of it set her teeth on edge. She took the order of a well-dressed man, who spoke with sheer confidence. He learned her name from the tag on her chest, and asked brazenly for her phone number. She merely raised a hand, displaying a wedding ring that had long since lost all relevance, then immediately returned to the grind. A noisy complaint from a customer who felt she was being too inefficient was loud enough for her to hear. A polite apology and a smile that could have almost passed for genuine was her response. She hurried off to fetch their order. As the shift went on, her stress levels continued to rise, and as a child continued to scream, a deep, unsettling disquiet bloomed in her heart. Despite her exhaustion, even after the cold night closed in, Aurora had not yet returned home. She sat upon a chilly step. The Sacré-Cœur church behind her was the highest point in the sky, and also happened to be a hot spot for travelers. As she finished playing a song on her guitar, a small audience clapped, and threw change into the instrument's case that lay open at her feet. Aurora thanked them gratefully, pulling her woolen hat lower to fend off the chill air, and breathing into her icy hands as the unimpressive crowd dispersed. While she waited for the feeling in her fingers to return, she sat and watched as people peddled their wares to tourists, low-quality junk that no one in their right mind would ever want. Sightseers continuously amassed to look upon the beautiful architecture of the church, to explore within it, and to get a view of Paris from on high. The lights of the city did have a certain charm to them, but for Aurora, her regular trips to the Sacré-Cœur had more to do with making her rent payments. As she adjusted the tuning and prepared for her next song, a blonde woman with a bundle in her arms and a toddler by her side approached.
"You have a beautiful singing voice,"
the mother said in her upper-class British accent.
"Thank you. I'm glad you like it."
Aurora replied in a manner somewhat broken, her English less than perfect. She eyed her strings, anxious at the thought of looking up at them all.
"Will you be singing another?"
the tourist asked. And in spite of herself, the lady with the guitar could not help but glimpse at the toddler at the parent's side. When she saw the little boy's faded eyes and bloated visage, she gasped in fright. He appeared corpse-like, and locked his dead stare with hers.
Est-ce tout ce que vous espérez qu'il sera?
He asked flawlessly in her native tongue, as rancid liquid poured from his mouth. Aurora blinked, and the boy became normal. A shudder passed through her very spirit.
"Non,"
she snapped, throwing her guitar into its case. As she slammed the case closed, much of the money inside spilled out onto the unyielding stone, but she didn't even consider trying to retrieve it.
Oh, okay.
the mother said in polite confusion. The little boy moved defensively behind her leg as Aurora took off. Slinging the instrument over her shoulder, Aurora weaved her way amongst the crowds and descended the many stairs that led away from the church. She wheezed as she made it to the bottom and entered the maze of winding streets that led back down into the city proper. It seemed, however, that as she descended, the path she walked became eerily devoid of life. Aurora walked with haste amongst houses that looked like they had been pulled directly from the past into the present. The streetlights were few and far between. They cast peculiar shadows all around her and did little to illuminate her surroundings. As she took quick and nervous strides between seemingly deserted buildings, heading towards the lights below, she began to notice the dark liquid that ebbed its way out of the cracks and crevices. It flowed from between window panes and from minuscule spaces amid brickwork, collecting in the street and tracing lines between the paving stones. As Aurora made her way down, a gentle trickle began to build, the burbling sound increasing in intensity until it resembled a distant roar. It reminded her of a noise she'd heard long ago, when her father told her that if she held a shell up to her ear, she would be able to hear the sea from inside. As the water began to collect around Aurora's feet, she could swear that something menacing lurked within it. It was an overwhelming and entirely irrational sensation of certainty, one that managed to completely grip her. She struggled to maintain a grasp on rationality, right up until something formless and rotten reached out from beneath her feet and tried to take a hold. Immediately she took off running, each footfall sending an icy spray billowing up around her. Behind, the distant ocean sound became deafening and morphed into an ear-shattering screech. Aurora could sense the presence that stalked her as something gave chase. She could almost taste its breath in the air, and it reeked of decay. As the girl with the guitarist's chest burned with exertion, she could not bring herself to steal a glance over her shoulder, sure that to look upon what followed could lead only to madness. As every breath became shallow and fatigue threatened to betray her, she came to a sudden stop when a figure lurched from an alleyway and into her path. Aurora collided with the silhouette, and both she and the stranger tumbled. The man let out a short grunt and winced as he caressed the elbow that had bore the brunt of the fall.
Je suis de mademoiselle désolé. Êtes-vous d'accord?
The middle-aged man asked respectfully, still slumped on the ground. Aurora looked up at the distant church, looming high above in the gloomy night. The street she had just ran down seemed impeccably ordinary. Without answering the stranger, she scrambled to her feet and made for home. Another long and restless night plagued the lady who sat forlornly in her apartment, until the sun arose once more. The leaky ceiling continued its endless rhythm, one drop at a time, and when morning did come and Aurora left for work, she could still hear that maddening beat. The cafe was packed and anarchic once again, and it was all the waitress could do to stay on her feet. Tension grew, and the ever-increasing weariness became intolerable. Worse yet, the same ruddy-faced baby returned, squawking incessantly. Even after it and the insufferable creature it spawned from had left the establishment, the baby's cry still lingered in her mind, piling on top of the galling clang that looped endlessly. This stuck with her for hours on end. It made keeping track of orders impossible, left her unable to focus when she tried to busk for extra cash, and drowned out the talk of all those around her. On edge, and begging under her breath for a brief reprieve, she dug her nails into her palms, deep enough to break the skin. What leaked free felt warm upon her frozen hands, and as she made her way up the stairs back to her apartment on the 10th floor, she forced them a little deeper into her flesh. Aurora left the stairwell and entered the hallway that led to her cramped home. The moment the exit behind her had closed, a loud creak above made the building itself quake, and with a heavy thud, something in the ceiling gave way. Water began to pour, running down the walls. As it trickled over the doorways, they too became liquid and were washed away. What replaced them was featureless, slick and cream-colored, coated in thick and disgusting grime. Aurora turned to look for a way out that no longer was. She slammed stinging hands against where the passage to the stairs had once been, only managing to mix blood with dirt. As the hall began to fill, cold liquid crept higher. It had already reached her knees when she finally gave up furiously striking at the unbreakable barrier, and dashed down toward where her apartment door should have been. When she reached it, it had been replaced by heavy rusted iron. Upon it was a circular handle. She tried to turn it, but it fought her every step of the way. Aurora abandoned her guitar and doubled her efforts. Friction created fire in her hands as the wheel finally began to turn. She clenched her jaw and cursed loudly under the strain as the water reached her waist. With a final Herculean effort, the handle spun and the rusty door fell open, sending her tumbling into her apartment, followed by a torrent of fluid. Soaked, the woman hauled herself back onto her feet, but before she could even gain her bearings, the damp spot on the ceiling collapsed. From it fell a vile and misshapen mass, congealed matter that spread upon the wet ground, and then seemed to flow and contort as though it were alive. Damp hair clung to her face, framing her scream as the creature began to morph. Disturbing, twisted limbs formed from its core, and distorted approximations of human faces rose and fell, wailing in endless agony. The beat in her head and the infinite cries of the screeching child that she could not seem to escape clashed with a deafening monstrosity, creating an unbearable maelstrom of noise.
Je te la faire cesser! S'il vous plaît, juste l'arrête de crier!
Aurora screeched, falling to her knees. The monster crept closer. Its decaying appendages in constant motion reached out towards her.
Laissez-moi tranquille!
She yelled against the unstoppable sound, covering her ears but finding no relief. Hurriedly she leapt to her feet and dove for the window as the already enormous thing expanded, blocking off any escape. As she fumbled with the window's latch, she looked back into the innumerable eyes of the being that cried out. Around them both, her apartment had begun to shift into a different state, and she realized she had to act fast. Forcing open the window, Aurora looked down into the street beneath. What was once a paved road had become a still and reflective surface. The height of the fall made her stomach turn, but she would do anything to escape the agonizing racket and the hideous monstrosity. Taking in a deep, final breath, the woman leapt out into the open space. Vicious winds whipped at her as she fell, and the endless clamor seemed to persist, even as she hurtled further and further from the hideous beast. Aurora's body pierced the shimmering street, and as she sank beneath it, a beautiful silence fell. In that first instance, she felt her entire body relax, and all the stress seemed to dissipate. Immediately something took a hold of her legs, wrapping around them and trying to pull her deeper. Instant panic caused her lungs to fill with cold fluid. Aurora struggled desperately against what lurked under her, but could not match its size or strength. It effortlessly clung to the thrashing woman, whose heart and mind raced uncontrollably. Suddenly, her situation ceased to matter. An all-embracing sense of euphoria washed over the one who was submerged. Her attempts to fight back were done, and her expression became serene. Hazy blue eyes stared up at the rippling sky, but they saw little as she was drawn into the dark below. Hey, what's up guys, Uncle Unit here, and I hope you enjoyed today's story. Insomnis is a collection of fictional horror stories written by Lux Noctis, and I would like to thank him for letting us have this series on the channel. His stories are very well written and interesting to read, and working on this project has definitely helped me become a better storyteller. Please support Lux by following him on Twitter and checking out his books on Amazon. Links can be found below. I cannot stress to you how important it is to support independent authors like Lux, so if you could give him a little bit of your undivided attention, I would very much appreciate that. Again, I want to thank all of you for stopping by and checking out the video, and I hope you come back for more scary stories. Until then, stay safe out there, and as always, never forget